Part 2. She dropped the hose, which writhed itself into a comfortable position and went on squirting over the driveway. "There's the canal," she said. The other great hand pushed her gently till she lay in the crook of the huge arm, like a very small doll. This was no time to bother about the mud or the smell of it. She saw the light of her own bedroom go past, slightly below her, the window still open. And as the giant woman turned up the street, when they reached the canal and stood on the bridge looking down, Lucy suddenly felt guilty. For some reason it was almost empty of water, as she had never seen it before. A long black oily puddle lay between slopes of drying grey mud, and embedded in the mud were rusty bicycles, supermarket trolleys, bedsteads, prams, old refrigerators, washing machines, car batteries, even 2 or 3 old cars, along with hundreds of rusty, twisted odds and ends, tangles of wire, cans and bottles of plastic bags. They both stared for a while. Lucy felt she was seeing this place for the first time. It looked like a canal, only when it was full of water. Now it was nearly empty. It was obviously a rubbish dump. "The river," came the voice, rumbling voice, vibrating through Lucy's whole body. The river ran between a strip of woodland, a mile away, across the fields. There was a strange ride for Lucy. The sun had risen, and the huge, clear, red ball. She could see a light from the farmhouse. A flock of sheep and lambs poured widely into a far corner. Any second she expected to hear a shout. But they reached the strip of trees, and there was the river. It swirled past, cold and unfriendly in the early light. The hand set Lucy down among the weeds of the bank, and she watched amazed as the gigantic figure waded out into midstream, till the water bludged and bubbled past those thighs like they were pillars of a bridge. There, in the middle of the river, the giant woman kneeled, bowed, and plunged under the surface. For a moment a great mound of foaming water heaved up, and the head and shoulders hoisted clear and glistening black, and plunged under again like the launching of a ship. Waves sloped over the bank and soaked Lucy to the knees. There, in a few minutes, it was like a giant sea beast out there, rearing up and plunging back under in a boiling of muddy water. Then, abruptly, the huge woman levered herself upright and came ashore. All the mud had been washed from her body, and she shone like black glass. But her great face seemed to writhe, as if in pain. She spat the water out, and a groan came from her. "It's washed you," she cried. "You're clean." But the face went on trying to spit out the water, even though it had no mortar to spit. "It burns," Lucy heard. "It burns." And the enormous jointed fingers, bunched into fists, rumbled and squeezed at her eyes. Lucy could see now in daylight. She gazed at the giant tubes of the limbs, the millions of rivets, the funny connections and joints. It was hard to believe what she's seeing. "Are you a robot?" she cried. Perhaps she thought someone far off is controlling this creature through a panel of dials. Perhaps she's a sort of human-shaped submarine. Perhaps. But the rumbling voice came up out of the ground, through Lucy's legs. "I'm not a robot," it said. "I am a real thing." And now the face looking at her, the huge eyes, the huge black pupils seemed to enclose Lucy like the giant grasp of a warm hand. The whole body looked like a robot, but the face was somehow different. It was like some colossal metal statue's face, made of parts that slid over each other as they moved. Now the lips opened again, and Lucy almost closed her eyes. She almost shivered in the peculiar vibration of the voice. "I am Iron Woman." "Iron Woman," whispered Lucy, staring at her again. "Are you wondering why I come?" the voice went on. Lucy nodded. "Because of this." The voice was suddenly louder and angry. Lucy winced, and the eyes opened even wider, larger, glaring at her. "What? Because of what?" Lucy had no idea. "Listen," rumbled the voice. Lucy listened. By now, the whole land inside the circle of the horizon was shimmering and bubbling with birdsong like a great plan. The birds?" she asked. "I can hear." "No." The black eyes flashed. A red light pulsed in their depths. Lucy felt suddenly afraid. What did she mean? "Listen! Listen!" The rumbling voice almost cracked into some kind of yell. A great hand had come out now and folded around Lucy's shoulders, just as her father would put his arm round her, while the other hand, with that colossal thumb and finger, just as daintily as it held the snowdrops, took hold of her hand and gripped it, softly but firmly. Lucy's fright lasted only for a second. Then she was overwhelmed by what she heard, a weird, horrible sound, A roar of cries, thousands, millions of cries, wailing, groans, screams. She closed her eyes and put her free hand over her ear. But it made no difference. The dreadful sound seemed to be pounded about her body, and if she were standing under a waterfall of it, she might be battered off her feet, or if she was standing in a railway tunnel, the express train was rushing towards her, an express of screaming voices. Finally, she could stand it no longer. She actually screamed herself. She opened her eyes, trying to drag her free hand and to twist free of the hand enclosing her shoulders. But the thumb and finger held her too tightly, and the engulfing hand gripped her too firmly. All the time the immense black eyes, so round, so fixed, stared at her. And even though her own eyes were wide and open, and horrible massive screams, yells, wails, groans came hurtling closer and closer, louder and louder, till she knew that in the next moment it would hit her like that express train and sweep her away. But at that moment the fingers and hand let go, and the sound stopped, as if the switch had been switched off. Lucy stood, panting with fear. She almost started to run, anywhere, away from where she'd been standing. But the great eyes, now half closed, had become gentle again. "Oh, what was it?" cried Lucy. "It was so awful." She felt herself trembling, and she knew she might burst into tears. Her ears were still ringing. "What you heard," said the voice, "is what I'm hearing all the time." "What is it?" cried Lucy again. "That," she said, "is the cry of the marsh. It's the cry of the insect, the leeches, the worms, the shrimps, the water skeeters, the beetles, the bream, the birch, the carp, the pike, the eels." "They're crying," whispered Lucy. "The cry of the ditches and the ponds," the voice went on, "of the frogs, the toads, the newts, the cry of the rivers, of the lakes, of all the creatures under the water, on top of the water, and all that go between. The water birds, the water voles, the water shrews, the otters. Did you hear what they were crying?" Lucy was utterly amazed. She saw in her mind's eye all those millions of creatures, all the creepy crawlies clinging to stones and weeds under the water, with their mouths wide, all screeching. And the fish. She could see the dense process of shuddering, flashing buckles and brooches, and millions of gold ring eyes, with their pouting lips stretched wide, screeching. And the frogs, they have no lips, screaming. She suddenly remembered how the giant woman had rubbed her eyes in pain, and she thought of the wet frogs, just as wet as the naked of eyeballs, burning, rubbing their eyes with their rubbery, almost human fingers. And the eels. That eel. Now she knew. That eel's silent writhings had been a screaming. "What's happening?" she cried. The Iron Woman raised her right arm and pointed at the river with her index finger. The ringing in Lucy's ears had seemed to come to an end, and that end, finger. She looked towards where the finger was pointing. The river rolled and swirled just as before, but now it seemed that a hole had appeared in it, a fiery hole, and she could see something moving far down in the hole. It was that eel again, just as she had seen it before, but there it was, writhing and knotting and unknotting itself. But it was coming towards her, just as if the fiery hole was a tunnel. It came dancing and converting itself in the bright fiery tunnel. Now it was very close to them. In the mouth of the strange hole she heard a crying. She knew it was the eel. And there were words in the crying. She could almost make them out, but not quite. She strained to listen, the words coming from the eel that seemed to be twisting and burning in a kind of fiery furnace. And it did seem to be burning. In front of her eyes it blazed and charred, becoming a smoky, dim shape, a spinning wisp. Then the hole was empty. But already another form had appeared far down the fiery hole, coming towards him in a writhing dance. It was a barbel. It danced as if it walked the water on its vibrating tail, swaying and twisting to keep its balance. Lucy could see the tentacles of its beard lashing round its mouth and jerked and spun in the fiery hole. And the barbel too was crying. It seemed to be shouting, or rather yelling, the same thing over and over. But still Lucy could not make out the words, and again as she strained to catch the words, the barbel writhed into a twist of smoke and vanished, just as the eel had done. But already far down in the hole she could see the next creature, and this time it was an otter. Just as the others, the otter came twisting and tumbling towards them, up the fiery tunnel, in a writhing sort of dance as it was trying to escape from itself. And then it came. It was crying something, just like the other eel and barbel. Again, Lucy could almost hear the words, louder and louder as it danced nearer and nearer, until it spun into a blot of smoke at the whole mouth and vanished. After that came a kingfisher. This dazzling little bird came whirling and crying till it fluttered itself into a blaze of smoke like a firework spinning on a nail. After that came a frog. The frog's dance was simply leaping up and falling down on its back. Then it scrambled to its feet, leapt up and fell on its back again. Over and over there was some kind of spinning, fiery bubble inside the fiery hole. But its voice came loud and clear, a wailing cry like the sound shouted again and again. But Lucy could still not make out what these words were, till the frog too whirled into smoke. And then came a squirming thing that Lucy could not make out. Then, with a shock, she recognised it. It was a human body, a human baby. It looked like a fat and pink newt jerking and failing inside the fiery bubble. But just like the other creatures, it came up the fiery tunnel, doing its dance, which was like a fighting and to kick and claw its way out of the fiery bubble. This time the crying was not like words. It was simple crying, wailing, desperate cry of a human baby when it cries as if it has entered the world. Lucy could bear it no more. She knew this baby too would suddenly burst into flames, blaze into a whirl of smoke and vanish. She dropped her face into her hands. Her shoulders shook as she sobbed. As she got control of herself, she suddenly thought, this is my nightmare. I'm back in it. If I made a big effort, I'll wake up and everything will be all right. And she looked up. But if she had hoped to see her attic bedroom with the case of 5 stuffed owls, it was no good. There in front of her eyes, the black columns of the legs of the Iron Woman. And there was the cold river, and she could feel the strangeness of her ears, that ringing, but fainter now, with the singing of birds breaking through. The Iron Woman was gazing through the trees. What's happened? Cried Lucy. Oh, what's wrong with everything? The rumbling voice shook the air all around them. Them, she heard in a low thunder. Them. They've done it, and I've come to destroy them. The great black eyes stared at Lucy, black and yet also red, with a dull glow. The voice came again, louder and like a distant explosion. Destroy them! And again, still louder, on the air of the ears, or her whole head seemed to split. Her body cringed as the jet fighter suddenly roared out of nowhere, 10 feet above the tree tops. Destroy them! Who? Lucy was wondering wildly. Who does this mean? Who are them? And she should have asked, but the Iron Woman had lifted a foot high above the ground, and for a frightful moment Lucy thought this huge, terrible thing had gone mad, like a mad elephant, was going to stamp her flat. Then the foot came down hard. The river bank jumped. The Iron Woman raised her other foot. She raised her arms, her giant fist clenched and unclenched. Her foot came down from the ground and leapt. Her eyes now glared bright red, like traffic lights in danger. Slowly the vast shape began to dance, there on the river bank, lifting one foot and slamming it down, lifting the other great foot. She began to circle slowly. Her stamping sounded like the deep, slow drum beats echoing through her iron body. But as she danced, she sang in that awful voice, as if Lucy were dangling from the tail of a jet fighter, just behind the jets. Destroy the poisoners, the ignorant ones. Destroy the poisoners, the ignorant ones. The rubbishers, destroy. The rubbishers, destroy. She wasn't singing so much as roaring and groaning, and she seemed to have forgotten Lucy. It was an incredible sight, the size of several large elephants rolled into one. And now, working herself up every second more and more enraged, and Lucy was thinking, she must mean the waste factory. People were always worrying about the waste factory poisons everything. She trampled the whole thing flat. She could trample the whole thing flat. Nothing would stop her. Lucy's father worked at the waste factory. Everybody worked at the waste factory. Only 1 month before, the waste factory had doubled its size. It was importing waste now from all over the world. It was booming. Her father had just got another rise in wages. At the same time, she thought of the millions of screams of the water creatures, and even that human baby inside the Iron Woman's body. No wonder she was roaring and writhing in that awful dance. All the creatures were screaming inside of her, and the sound came out of her mouth in this terrible roar. Everybody within miles must be hearing it, and maybe the Iron Woman truly was going mad in front of her eyes, with the torments of all those burning, twisting and screaming water creatures inside of her. Then Lucy swayed on her feet. The darkness came rushing in from all sides, and she dropped in a faint. And she lay there unconscious on the earth beneath her, jolted and quivered. End of chapter 2.